And welcome back to the Insights Festival show. Our main stage is closed, but the Fringe programming is about to begin, and we wanted to first introduce you to the Insights Festival show with a little section to talk a little bit about polls. Polls, one of the most visible part of the data research and insights community. Polls are a thing which inform the rest of the world about how people feel about their governments, about businesses, about opinions in general, whether it be new products or new services, whether we want the sky to be blue or the sky to be red. Polls can tell us a lot about our societies. They can tell us a lot about the state of our world. And I am really delighted to be talking to a few people today. We're going to be explaining a little bit about how polls work, why they can still be trusted, and what we as a data research and insights community are doing to ensure that trust in polls can be maintained. So it brings me a great pleasure to welcome to the show Yoke, who is one of my colleagues. She's a professional standards executive, and she's going to be telling you a little bit about what SMR does in order to support the polling industry and also to keep it on the right track. Yoke, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you, Kim. I'm very happy to be here, and we're talking about polls today, and election polling specifically. And for anyone interested in or working with polls, election polls, and pollsters, ISOMAR's Professional Standards Committee has developed a range of products, from a guideline for pollsters to a report on the freedom to conduct polls, from a paper on the accuracy of polls from actually the last 40 years, to FAQs, frequently asked questions for journalists, for opinion leaders. And we've got everything combined on isomar.org/polling. So the Professional Standards Committee is really, because it's such a visible part of the data research and insights industry, finds it very important that polls are reported on well and that they are of good quality. So today we're going to talk a bit more about accuracy in polls and how we can still trust them. I am joined today by Kathy Frankovic. She is former director of surveys for CBS News and current polling expert on ISOMAR's Professional Standards Committee, and she's doing a lot of work with us on everything I just mentioned. And also joining us today is Ben Page, Chief Executive at Ipsos Mori in the UK. So without further ado, let me start by asking the first question. And let me direct that question to you, Ben. Are polls still useful? Aren't we living in a post-expert world? Do people still trust pollsters?
Well, I can only speak for the country I know best, which is the UK. But first of all, so trust in opinion polls actually in Britain has stayed at about the same level for the last few years. It's actually risen recently. And overall, if you go back to 1940 in World War II, there's a professor called Will Jennings at Southampton University who has studied every opinion poll and every election since, I think, 1942. And he has looked at the accuracy of polls over decades. And his conclusions are that overall, opinion polls are no more accurate, but also no less accurate than they've ever been. And actually, in my own country, in Britain last year, we had a very successful European election and a very successful general election. Average error in the general election, Ipsos Mori, but also very good for all the other pollsters, was actually only 0.3% per party. And I think finally, if polls weren't useful, business and particularly politicians wouldn't spend so much money on them.
If I may add something, I think that it's fair to say that people believe the polls, they still believe the polls, even though they might not say to a pollster that they trust the people who are doing them. We have an instinct to look for certainty. We have an instinct to look for numerical explanations of where we are. And certainly Americans are doing this. If you look at the reading and the attention that's being paid to the people who report multiple polls, like the polling aggregators, they are major players in journalism. I think that people are always interested in finding out about themselves and finding out about where they sit in terms of the entire population of the country. And polls are the way you do that.
If I may jump in on this, Yoka, I think there's also a question which, of course, looms over the polling industry, and that's, of course, the Brexit use case and also the Trump use case, where most polls actually gave the victory to Clinton back in the previous election. And that, of course, are often kind of cases which were said, the polls got it completely wrong. So I wanted to kind of ask you both kind of, should we expect the same with regards to the current situation? Trump is again being shown as lagging well behind in the polls, except for a couple of them, and a couple of the ones where he isn't lagging, those are precisely the ones which, quote unquote, got it right. So I wanted to kind of pose a question then to Kathy, can we trust the polls with regards to the upcoming US election, which everyone around the world, I think, is looking at with real either concern depending or real excitement depending on who you're voting for, or who you're hoping that will win the elections?
Well, let me put it this way. Whenever there is this sort of eruption of criticism following an election, pollsters take it seriously. So you will find this year in the United States that there's an extreme focus on the Electoral College. As you all know, I'm sure, the American president is not elected by a popular vote majority, by getting more votes nationwide. An American president is elected by assembling 270 electoral votes in the Electoral College. The Electoral College has not been a factor, I guess, since 2000 in Florida. But it really often isn't a factor, and Hillary Clinton was ahead in the polls by an average of 3 points. She won the popular vote by about 2 percentage points. So in a way, the conclusion that was drawn after the fact is that the national polls were just fine. There may have been issues, and there were issues with a number of statewide polls. So this year, you have pretty much every polling organization dealing with this as a state-by-state election. You're not just looking at the national total, you have to look at swing states in the Midwest and swing states in the West. You're looking at the states that could make the difference in who wins the election. That said, it's if the lead that Biden has nationally at the moment, Joe Biden over President Trump, holds, it's hard to imagine a scenario where he doesn't carry the Electoral College, but it is possible. So this is the attention that people are paying is going to be very different. I also just want to add one thing, and that is that after something like the 2016 election, the instinct that people has, and I guess this goes to the question of whether people trust polls, the instinct that people has is to say, oh, they got it all wrong. Well, some people got it wrong, but the measurements that were taken nationally were actually pretty much dead on.
Yeah, it's the same with the Brexit debacle, where if you looked at the run of polls in the run up to the referendum, what it would have shown you is that very narrowly Leave was ahead. Now, on the day, we all had to make judgments. Ipsos Mori took a 51% for Leave and turned it into 48% for Remain. And I don't have time on a phone call to explain the detail of the assumptions that we made, but they were all about differential turnout by different groups based on past experience. But I think what has happened in both Britain and America over the last 5 years is that you've had a series of very close political events. And what we sometimes forget in the industry, in part because the polls are generally accurate, that if you've got a 2% margin of error, or a 3% margin of error, that normally doesn't matter. But actually, the events that we've had recently, 3% really does matter, and that is part of the explanation about this narrative that has taken hold. But as I say, the exit polls in Britain have actually been consistently very accurate for at least a decade. The benefit of the exit polls is, and we conduct them for the BBC and ITV, you're speaking to people after they've actually voted, which is a huge benefit. But generally, it's this issue that very often the accuracy of this noise in the data, which is inevitable in an individual poll, 2 or 3% margin of error, normally it doesn't matter. But actually, of course, you've just had this series of events where it really did matter. But as Kathy says, I think I'm hoping that my American colleagues have massively improved their ability to do state level polling so that we won't have the upset with the Electoral College that we had last time. But it's a reminder that, every poll, 95 times in 100 is within those margins. You've got a 5 in 100 chance or a 1 in 20 chance, even with the best conducted poll in the world, that it will still go outside that. And finally, while I'm talking, I think there's a big issue about this obsession that we have when we talk about political polls, about the horse race. It's all about who's ahead 2 or 3 points. The other huge benefit of polling generally is to understand, what issues are people actually voting on? What are the stories that are actually motivating people to go out and vote? What is this election actually about? And polling, when we move away from the horse race, is absolutely vital to understand what is going on in a country.
Thank you, Ben.
If I may just add on to that one thing. Just one thing. I think what this teaches us is that have to have a little bit of modesty and be mildly humble in terms of reporting their results. Now, that doesn't mean they can control other journalists or people who are talking about the polls, but in their own presentations, they need to be aware of all of the things that Ben just mentioned.
I'd agree with you, Kathy. I think the problem, that there is a challenge with the news media and particularly with social media, that on the day of the referendum, we had 51% for leave. When I later looked at this with the Royal Statistical Society, as we were doing a wash-up, of course, they're saying, well, on that sample size, you really shouldn't have said anything. You should have just said it's too close to call. And the problem is with the newspaper that you're doing the poll for, they want a front page. And if you say, Ben Page says it's very close. Well, yeah, but Ben, what are the actual numbers? What's the actual? Oh, Ben, so it's 51%. Is it 52? But there's only a 60% chance that's right. It could easily go the other way. And I said that I was saying that in the media, but that is not. People are not interested in probabilities. They want certainty. And I think, as Kathy says, through humility, but also trying to educate journalists about probabilities rather than certainty is also important.
That's true.
Well said, Ben. So, Kathy, are Trump's concerns about mail ballot voting a concern in the US? Would it influence the work that pollsters do in the US?
Well, I think every single polling organization is now asking people how they intend to vote. And everyone who does that is discovering pretty much the same thing. A majority of those who are supporting Joe Biden say that they will vote by mail. A majority of those who are supporting President Trump said that they will go to the polls on Election Day. Now, that clearly is going to be refined as we get closer to the election. For example, if someone says they're voting by mail, are they living in a state where ballots are going to be sent to everybody? That's 10 states. That's 1/5 of all the states. Every registered voter is going to get a ballot. Or do they have to request it? At which point you need to know if they have requested it, and you need to know whether they've requested it in time. So it complicates your measures of turnout and figuring out what turnout is going to be. And obviously those people who say they're going to the polls on Election Day, then you have to take into consideration things that might hold them back. Are they afraid of COVID? Is it raining? Is it snowing? Is something else going on that's going to keep them from the polling place? All of these things make it more complicated. They're all things you can measure, but you have to deal with them quite carefully.
Yeah, and the weather one is an interesting one because we just had a winter election in Britain for the first time in over 80 years, I think in nearly 100 years. And as most of the folklore going back to elections at different times of year has shown, that actually overall the weather doesn't actually affect turnout that much, particularly when we do have a lot of people voting by post. One of the challenges is if a lot of people are voting by post early, is to know if you're doing a final poll that week, finding a way of counting the people who've already voted accurately. But all these are issues that pollsters are very familiar with. And as Kathy says, I mean, at least on the general election, on the national vote, actually, in America, there isn't really any case to answer. It's all about the accuracy of the some of the individual state races.
If I may jump in with a question myself, I have a question which I know a lot of people in the public might have as well, with regards to polls' ability to influence elections, in the sense that, you know, if you call an election for one particular candidate, it has an influence. Would you say that that's
I mean, look, pollsters want to be right. We're not. Yeah. And the other thing we found,
I have an example from a while ago.
Okay, go on.
Oh, I was going to say I have an example from a while ago, but it's definitely the case that people are aware of what the polls are saying. If you ask people close to the election who is ahead in the polls, they'll give the right answer. Most of them will give the right answer, even those who are supporting the losing candidate. Now, that's a two-candidate race, which is what we mostly have in the US. When you get into multiple parties, you get strategic voting. I mean, you have to calculate what is the right thing for you to do in terms of who you support, who you don't want to win. And that one of the things you use to do that are polls. And the voters do use it, and they do change their minds towards the end, most particularly in multi-candidate elections. We have relatively little experience with those in the US.
The British experience is that around half. Go on, Joe.
Go ahead, Ben.
So that's a nice segue to our next question. Isomar has this report on the freedom to conduct opinion polling. So what is the state of the world beyond the US and the UK, Kathy?
Well, in the US and the UK, there really are no infringements on the right to conduct opinion polls. They can be conducted, they can be reported. There's no publication embargo. And so you could say there's freedom to conduct polls. In other parts of the world, in many places, there is the same sort of government response to polling. But in other places, there are legal restrictions that prevent polls from being published in a country before a certain period before the election. 7-day embargoes are not uncommon. 15-day embargoes are not uncommon. They exist even in Europe, in several European countries. And some countries, and I'm not talking now about countries where no polling is done. I'm talking about countries that theoretically can conduct polls. In some countries, election polls can't be done months before an election, which means they're relatively useless, and you don't know anything about what's going to happen at the polling place until the election takes place. So SMR has done, as Joka mentioned before, a freedom to publish document. They've done 5, 6 of these with WAPOR, the World Association for Public Opinion Research, which summarizes the restrictions in each country for which we have information, and it's really most countries in the world. And that's something that you can find on the SMR website.
I think there's also, as we're talking about, and I think of polling as part of freedom of speech to a certain extent. And I think we're in 90 countries. And one of the things that's very clear is even in countries that are ostensibly democracies, and even in periods when there aren't any bans, we are getting into a position where if you do something the government doesn't like, even though it's legal, you find your offices are raided for health and safety reasons, or there's suddenly a tax investigation into the company, which requires all your computers to be taken away for 3 months. And this, so it's not, if anything, it's getting worse. My observation would be, I don't know what Kathy's view is. My view is it's actually probably getting worse rather than better, because governments are becoming more sophisticated about controlling the media space generally. But I'd really be interested in that. But that's my perception, having just worked in one company for 30 years.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I see that. I mean, one of the striking things that I've seen over time is that when you get to countries that have not been democracies, that are, coming out of autocratic histories, if you conduct an opinion poll there, you get massive information from the public. I mean, when we first started doing work in Moscow and in Russia, when places like even the Republic of Georgia. I mean, there are a number of countries where you don't have a history of this sort of event, of this sort of political participation, and it seems, at least at first, that people take to it the public takes to it quite easily. So
No, I'm
I
sure.
think
I know
that we may be seeing now, but
no, I agree with that. That once it's allowed as part of free speech, people will do. There will be great enthusiasm for it. But my observation is that, I mean, Russia is a very good example. That in more countries, actually, it's gradually being suppressed. And there are lots of reasons why commercial researchers in a country like Britain and America will do one thing in Britain and America, but in other countries, there will be self-policing imposed effectively by fear, where the company, even if they were interested in doing political polling or even published polls, they won't do it because it's going to make life very miserable.
The time is ticking, and I wanted to ask you, if there have been any questions coming in from the public, which have perhaps we should be infusing into the debate and the conversation we've been having with Ben and Kathy.
Yeah, so we received one question, and that is, are polls sophisticated enough when the electoral system they are trying to measure have multiple influencing factors like voter suppression, activity, etc., that are not necessarily baked into more pure polling methodologies? So, Kathy, what would be your view on that?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think that you may be able to measure this in terms of people's expectations for being able to vote. It's certainly possible that you could append a question to a survey in a state where you know that there might be voter suppression measures as to whether people think their vote is they're going to be allowed to vote, whether they think their vote is going to be counted accurately, whether they think the election is going to be fair. And I've asked that question multiple times over historically. So you do have that. The other thing you really need to look at is, I think, and you need to do this by state in the United States, but you need to look at the composition of the people who are the voters. How many of them have not voted? I mean, how many new voters are there going to be in 2020 who didn't vote in 2016? We certainly expect turnout to go up, but how much do we expect it to go up? We don't really know. And even in a national poll, 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton may have won the popular vote, but if you took out the state of California, she didn't. The California margin for her was so enormous that take it away and Donald Trump gets more popular votes than Hillary Clinton does. So, it's a complicated matter. It's a matter of where you go. It's a matter of looking at the internals in a state. Where in the state are these people coming from? I mean, where do they live? Do they live in big cities? Do they live in the countryside? So I think there's a lot you can do, but you can do something and probably should do something.
Yeah, I mean, I think well-conducted surveys of the total population are first of all going to find out, overall, what does the overall population think about the candidate and what might they say, how would they vote if they voted? And then there's usually a whole detailed set of questions about their likelihood of voting for whatever reason, whether it's their own, somebody stopping them, you can check whether they're registered to vote. So these are all things that are fairly standard, to be honest. And so if people are, some of the forms of voter suppression are both direct, where you actually try and physically make it impossible to register, or you make the polling stations so far away that people give up and they don't, and we can show you that they haven't voted by post. But the other things I think that are slightly more insidious, but again, polling should pick them up, are things like Facebook campaigns where you're trying to persuade voters that, you know, they're all the same, so don't bother, they're all the same, you know, just don't bother voting. And because you know, if in this example, if you're a Republican, you know that your voters are more motivated. But again, assuming this, and this is generally, I think, one of the lessons, certainly it's a lesson in the UK, if the sample is fully representative, if we've dealt with the issue of turnout, which is one of the most difficult issues in political polling, once we've done it, as long as you've got your basics right, the polls should perform pretty well, even if all the dynamics are complicated. Because in one sense, that you can have all the factors in the world, you know, it can be as complicated as you like. The key issue we're measuring is, how likely are you to vote? And then who are you going to vote for? So it's actually only two things we need to get right. It's not assuming we've got a representative sample to start with.
The time is ticking, and unfortunately, I think we have to go towards kind of final remarks or anything that you want to share with the general public. I wanted to kind of offer, you know, Yoka, Ben, and Kathy one final piece of advice or one final piece of information you would like people from around the world to know about opinion polls or to know about the work that SMR is doing to try to make sense of how polls work, to increase trust and confidence in what polls do around the world. Kathy, do you want to get us going?
Well, I will say a few things that SMR has done. SMR has partnered with WAPOR and with the American Association for Public Opinion Research to take a course that was developed by APOR for journalists, hosted at the Pointer organization, and turn it into a truly international course. We are in the process of trying to update it and in the process of trying to make it visually more interesting than it has been for the last little bit. So that's a measure that we're taking, looking ahead and trying to deal with journalists. One of the things that I notice as I read it, as I review the course, is that there is certainly a lot of attention being paid to being careful about what you report and being careful about how precise you think things are. As Ben said before, you report the numbers. Yes, 51% favor leave, but you then couch it in terms that says, but this is a poll, opinions could change, and this is quite close.
Ben, the floor is yours.
Yeah. On polling generally, I would just say, look, actually, despite all of the recent phenomena, overall, if you look at the long run, polls have actually remained very accurate. But at the same time, remember, the margin of error is there on any poll, even if you like it. And we need to get people, both in the industry and outside, just to keep reminding themselves about those inevitable margins of error.
And Yuka, from the SMR side?
Yeah, so I would actually like to reiterate what Ben said. The margin of error is very important. So always, if you see a number, just think that it could also be 2% more or 2% less. I mean, this is, it's not an exact number. And yeah, check our website to see all the things ISOMAR has on polling. And you can find it at isomar.org/polling.
Yes, and I would also perhaps add as well that if you ever have any concerns about polls or that are being conducted around the world, you can indeed reach out to SMR, the global voice of the data research and insights community. We do have services available open to the general public. If you have, you know, a poll that you're not sure about, just get in touch with us, and we can always check it out alongside you to see if, you know, if the poll makes sense or if the things have been conducted without the compliance with the ICC SMR code, which is, of course, a global currency safeguarding the polls, but as well as the market research sector worldwide. I just want to extend a huge word of thanks to Kathy, to Ben, to Yoka for spending a bit of time with us this evening here in Amsterdam, perhaps a different time zone for the others. It's been great to hear from you kind of where polls are, what value they still have today, and that, you know, there is still room for trust and confidence in what polls report as potential forecasts of the future. Thank you so much for your time. For those of you who've been watching the Insights Festival show, stay tuned. We have a few more sessions today. I'm going to North America, and we're going to be exploring with a number of researchers the state of the world according to insights, but from the North American perspective. So we have a few shows foreseen. I also want to extend a huge word of thanks to friends NetQuest, who are sponsoring the Fringe Insights Festival. They have made this possible, and we hope that you enjoy the show. There's a lot more coming, and tomorrow as well. The main stage is back, so if you haven't booked your Insights Festival ticket, now is the time to get it. There are still plenty of tickets available. We are still broadcasting from the 14th to the 17th of September, so there's a lot more insights to come. And do stay tuned. We have the North American focus.